I'd like to introduce our research partner, who is Sean Herbig of IQS. He is a phenomenal researcher and has been a phenomenal partner of Dare to Care for these 3 years. He has his team here. They have been really, really wonderful in working with our neighbors. And Sean, I'm excited to have you talk to us today.
Thank you for those kind words, and thank you guys for the opportunity to be here today and to have my team here. Um, Before I get in, I just want to say something very clearly and very sincerely. It's not just research to us. This comes from the heart because we're part of this community too. And we see this. We see homelessness in various ways, and we see food insecurity in various ways, and we see addiction in various ways, and it matters. I know it matters to each one of you, and I just want you to know very sincerely, this isn't a job to us or a project to us. This is something we feel it in our bones. So, as Ursula mentioned so correctly, Dr. Bullen stated, this is wave 3 of 3, right? So, if you guys were here at the event about a year or so ago, we talked more about waves 1 and 2. Just to give you a brief recap, just to let you know all the pieces that have kind of come together. Wave 1 was more that quant side, right? So primary quantitative research is a real fancy name for survey-based research, right? So whether that be in-person interviews, paper surveys, online surveys, it happens to be the whole gambit, right? And I'll tell you, a lot of people ask about, well, how often do we do paper surveys anymore? It just seems like with the internet, that's dead. Well, there's some truth to that, except the problem with the internet is that whole digital divide, right? Which tends to be economically disadvantaging, right? So we do a lot of paper. Ask my team. We do a lot of paper. And what about multi-language? Yeah, absolutely. We do a lot of paper in a lot of different languages. Yes, we use QR codes. We've got all the technology too. But we don't shy away from paper because we know our population, quite frankly, tends to feel comfortable with it, right? So if they're comfortable with it, we're comfortable with it. So that was a whole lot of wave 1, right? So we had about 2,000 responses on that. Then, as Ursula mentioned, we got into wave 2, which was primarily focus groups, right? So we wanted to get groups of people, and of course, we did some of those. Some of those were online. Again, sometimes that does work in this population. Not a lot. Most of them were in person, and we did things like we used libraries of elementary schools, right? So in the neighborhoods, so we went to where people were. And then, of course, we targeted for recruitment people who lived in those areas. We wanted it to be minimal barrier so you could literally walk there. And of course, this was back during the summer, so the weather was a little bit nicer, so you could walk in. And were the people compensated for their time? Yes, they absolutely were, because that's part of doing respectful research, right? And particularly with this community, it's very often in the research space, people say, well, can you do it without compensation? You can. The bigger question is it the right thing to do? No, it is not. So you comp, and we do, and we did. And then for wave 3, which is what I'll be talking about today, we did a panel discussion where the panel, what we were looking at is doing surveys with people in the community, but kind of doing okay, right? So you're talking about people who are out. One, they had access to the internet, and they had a household income between about $30,000 and $60,000. So they weren't rich, but they were probably getting by, right? We also did a lot of interviews with people who had come to the food pantries and were new to the food pantries. And that was something that we really wanted to understand, is if you were new to the food pantry, you had just started using it, what did your journey look like? Because you weren't using a food pantry 6 months ago, so you were in a different situation. What happened? And what did that journey look like? So a lot of those one-on-one interviews, those 34 interviews, those were people what we call new pantry users, right? So that's what the research is. That's what we've done. So hundreds of hours of interviews, thousands of responses. We think we've got a pretty good data set. And here's what we're going to tell you, and this is probably not going to be a surprise for the people in this room. The problem is complex. So if you were sitting here going, dang, why haven't I fixed this yet? Because I've been working on it really, really hard for a long time, and all my teammates have been working on it really, really hard for a long time. It's not your fault. The problem's freaking hard. It just is, right? So we start to look at things like, and we saw this in the wave 1 and wave 2 data. So things like, there's not enough money for food. People had to choose between food and other necessities. Boy, and that's a real thing to mess with your mind, because when people tend to choose between food and other necessities, they tend to pick the other necessities first, which is crazy, because you could be hungry in a house that has the electricity bill paid, and you might be feeling okay because the electricity bill's paid because your electricity didn't get shut off, but your pantry's empty, right? We prioritize so often bills over the food. And let's be honest, we need them both, right? You gotta have them both. But when we talk about the idea of things being complicated, it starts to look like this. It does get messy. So yeah, we're having to choose between food and da da da. So 60% paying for food versus paying for medicine or medical care. 50% choosing between paying for food and paying for rent or mortgage. Um, it, it's hard, right? There's a lot of stuff that comes into the equation that makes things difficult. So the problem's complex. And when we did the interviews, this is what we found. A lot of people said, I was doing okay. Like things were working. I wasn't rich, but I could make ends meet. It was going all right. But then things just started to shift. And now I'm just struggling to get by each day. And we'll say, well, what shifted? Well, it's kind of a little bit of everything. Gas got more expensive. Groceries sure as heck got more expensive. We all know that. Maybe they were coming home one day from work. Maybe they lost a couple of shifts, right? They lost a few hours at work, so they were doing okay. But maybe they were working at a restaurant, so not as many people are eating out now, so they're not getting as many shifts, or maybe they're not getting as many tips. And maybe they didn't cut their grass because things have been kind of busy, and maybe the lawnmower's broken down. And now maybe they go to pull their car in, and they're parking kind of in the yard. And now all of a sudden something's been left out. Now all of a sudden they pop their tire and they don't have the money to replace the tire, so now they don't go back to the job, so now they lose the job, so now you see how this goes, and it's like, for all of, Rome, was it for one of a nail, all of Rome fell, or something like that? I mean, these aren't dumb people who are lazy. These are hardworking people, but things are just getting tougher. They were hard before, and things are just getting tougher, right? And a lot of people tell us, I'm just trying to get by on a day-to-day basis. And we said, well, okay, again, from a place, from the heart, we say, we respect that. Let's talk about the pathway. Where does a food pantry fit in? And so we start talking about it. And here's the thing. People are moderately inclined to use a food pantry. Now, I don't know about you, but I've been doing research a long time. I don't get real excited about the word moderately inclined, right? If y'all were walking down one of these ice-covered sidewalks and you slipped and fell and you thought you broke your arm, and I ask you, how likely are you to go to the immediate care center? I don't think you'd be moderately inclined. You'd be like, I'm going to the immediate care center. I broke my dang arm. But that's not what we see here. People are only moderately inclined to go to the food pantries. So we asked this question. So we asked this to the panelists. Again, these are people kind of doing okay in that $30,000 to $60,000 range. So how likely would you be to use a food pantry if your family experienced a financial hardship? Now, we defined a financial hardship, and basically it was this. You've got one income, you've got one person working in the household, and they lost their job. Right? So it's not like you lost a couple bucks, you lost you lost your primary source of income. How likely would you be to go use a food pantry? 62% on a scale of 1 to 5. So 62% gave us a 4 or 5. 20% gave a 3. That's 1 out of 5. 1 out of 5 people said, probably be all right. Only 62% of people said that they would even consider it. So 62% in this case is not a number that we go, oh, it's really good. Not so much. And when we dive deeper and we start looking at it and we say, okay, well, let's start to take this apart and let's start to look at the individual pieces. What changes would you make in this hypothetical scenario in the first couple of weeks? And we gave them a whole list of changes that they could make, right? I'm going to eat out less. I'm going to cut the subscription services. I'm going to, start buying, store brand food as opposed, whatever, right? 44% of people said in the first week or two they would consider using a food pantry. Now, I don't know how good your math is. I'm assuming it's pretty good. But if you're like me, 44% is less than half. That's not a big number, right? Now, you can say, okay, but, Sean, let me play the devil's advocate. It's still about half, and we're only talking the first week or two. They probably have food in their freezer. They probably have food in the pantry. Maybe things aren't so bad, Sean. Don't catastrophize. I will catastrophize because we also asked them, okay, fine, what about in your first month or two? What changes would you make? Gave them the same set of options. Using a food pantry went from 44 to 50%. is like the fourth lowest, fourth highest, I guess, from the top 1, 2, 3, 4. It's like the fourth item. And we only gave them a list of like 7 things that they could choose. So they're not thinking about a food pantry as being a solution. They recognize the problem. Again, these aren't dumb people. They're recognizing the problem. They're recognizing the food insecurity, but they're not seeing food pantries as an option. Why? Why not? So this comes out of the one-on-one interviews, and it gets pretty deep. It gets pretty compelling. I'm not exaggerating when I say that tears were shed in many of these interviews. I'm not exaggerating when I say afterwards, there was almost some trauma decompression with the interviewer, because this stuff is real. Vince can attest to that. It comes down in a lot of cases, this is not a total picture, but it's a big part of the picture, is what we call deference and shame. By the way, shame different than embarrassment. We'll talk about that. What does that look like? Deference was this. Why aren't you going to use a food pantry? You know what? I need it, but others need it worse. They are worse off. We would literally have people say things like, look, if I've got a jar of peanut butter in the pantry, I don't want to take something else from somebody who doesn't have a jar of peanut butter in the pantry. And sometimes it's difficult to hear that because we're talking about people who are living real experiences. They're relaying to you what's actually happening. This isn't hyperbole or hypotheticals. And you're sitting here, it's difficult to say, because I can tell you, as I got my Kroger order last night, I have like 3 jars of peanut butter in my pantry. And it's like, dude, take another thing of peanut butter. It's okay. No. Somebody else needs it worse. They're worse off than me. So there's that deference. I don't want to take from somebody else. I may be in trouble, but other people are truly desperate, and I don't want to be the person who takes from them. That's real. Homeless came up, right? The unhoused. You know what? I get it, but the food pantries, again, if you're homeless, you need it. I got a roof over my head. Because I made that trade-off. I didn't have money to go to the grocery and pay my utility bill, and I paid my utility bill, so I got a house. Other people don't, and I don't want to take from them. On the shame side, and this is different than embarrassment, right? Because if you fell down on that sidewalk, when you're going to be very inclined to go to the doctor because you broke your arm, you might be a little embarrassed that you slipped and you fell and you said, oh gosh, nobody wants to be seen as being kind of, as the kids say these days, extra, right? So you don't want to be that person. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is people said, I don't want people to think I failed. That idea of failure came up a lot. That exact F word came up. That the idea of being in the pantry at some level to some people was equated with failure. It's my job to provide for me. It's my job to provide for my family. If I'm going to a food pantry, then maybe I failed. And I don't want to be seen that way, right? Because what we know is human dignity does require respect, right? Self-respect, but then also respect from others. And people don't want to give that up, and they shouldn't. I don't want people to think I failed. I don't want people to think I'm broke, right? Big part, sort of analogous to that failure. Last one, I'd argue maybe dances a little bit around the embarrassment side. I don't want to be seen by my former coworkers. I don't want people to see me in that line, right? So it's other people are worse off, and I don't want to be seen as failing. So we would argue some of the biggest barriers to food pantry usage aren't the logistics. And I'm not going to say the logistics are perfect. You guys have heard me talk about that. We got some work to do on logistics. I'm not going to let you off the hook on that. But I'll say this, and this is the reason we order it like this. If you just fix the logistics, if you had perfect information out there, you would not solve the problem, right? The biggest barrier to that front door is in the head and the heart. It's not knowledge, right? But here's the thing. Sort of end this on a positive note, if there is. When people do try, when they do go to the pantry, they tend to have a positive experience. Our pantries are not perfect, but they are good. They are. There's a lot we can feel good about in terms of providing these pantries. Yes, 27 million pounds of food. Hello, that's huge. But here's the other thing. when people go in and they evaluate this food, and by the way, we saw a lot of this in the Wave 1 research, right? So this was asked completely independently, reconfirms it. We love this in research when stuff is independently confirmed and it comes to the same conclusion because it gives us more faith in that conclusion. But what do we see? People said, hey, you know what? The food was actually better than I thought it was going to be. And beyond that, there were other services there like diapers and toiletries and bill pay assistance and things that I didn't even know that I could ask for, right? They were just there. And the process was easier and more respectful. Remember how important that respect is. It was easier and more respectful than people expected. So there was positivity on that. So the barriers are tough. The barriers tend to be emotional, not logistical. But by God, when we can cross those barriers on the other side of that door, we're doing good stuff. So we got a lot of work to do, but we should feel good about what we've accomplished thus far. That's all I have. Thank you.
Oh, sure. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sean. So now we're going to transition to have a panel discussion. So if our panelists will come up and join me, we'll have a seat here. I know we all heard a lot of information, and Sean did a wonderful job of making this easy to consume. And that's one of the other things IQS is so good at, is taking complex information and making it make sense for us. So we appreciate that. Okay, so I want to introduce friends who are with us. I'd like to introduce Dr. Shireen Deobakta. She is with Reach Evaluation, and she is a very cool social science researcher. You can ask her what that means later. She does a lot of really cool things. And then we've got Shane here, who is an esteemed board member with Dare to Care, Shane Schlatter, and also the executive director of Exodus Ministries. So Shane is not only a board member, but he represents our partner agencies and can share with us more about what that neighbor experience looks like. And then finally, last but not least, we have our wonderful CEO, Vincent James, here to join us. And we are grateful for everyone's time here and participation on the panel. So thank you guys so much for being here. We have one microphone over there, and we can pass it around. I think you know how to use a microphone. Vincent James is also a pastor, so I was getting ready to tell him how to turn on the microphone. That was a bad joke. Oh, all right, so we'll just pass that around. So we just heard a lot of really heavy information, and it is a lot to swallow, even hearing Sean kind of say what we'd seen already on the slides. I want to give a chance for us to just level set and just get a little bit of your gut reaction to what you just heard. Vincent, since you have the microphone, do you want to start there?
Yes, I'll start. First of all, thank you everyone for being here. As Ursula already has said, this has been an incredible journey as we're in this wave 3 phase of the research. And I initially thought when I arrived at Dare to Care that food banks and food pantries were opportunities definitely for folks to be able to have access to food, but they would come first to get food before anything else. That was what I was sharing. I was thinking about in terms of how we're framing our work around that idea and thought. And then when the data came in and said, no, you're not. A lot of people don't want to even come to food pantries and to the food bank because of shame, indifference. That was eye-opening for me because then it began to help me to think about framing language going forward in terms of ways and opportunities we can begin to assist neighbors to make it easier for them to more likely use a food pantry.
I'm not surprised at all, unfortunately, but I mean, it is good to be able to quantify what I think the partners see on a daily basis, and I'm not surprised. We see a lot of people that really have to overcome that barrier to want to use a food pantry. I think they are relieved to find out that that experience is a lot different than what they initially thought. But then I also see that usually by the time they use the food pantry, a lot of their life has fallen into chaos. At that point, they are behind on bills, they're struggling, there's financial strain, there's traumas going on. So the food is like the tip of the iceberg. And so typically that's the last thing they try to address. And by then they're struggling with so much that not being nourished properly. How do you process all these other stressors that are going on in your life? So yeah, we see it.
Honestly, it's not that surprising. We're all just a few paychecks away from being there, and it does not feel good. It's not, it's a very emotionally laden, heavy place to be. If you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's a very real food, shelter being threatened, and that does not feel good. It's overwhelming, and it just creates a cognitive overload. It's just hard to make decisions when you're in that space.
Yeah. Thank you. So as we think about, how Sean opened up sharing the data, which is by saying it's a complex issue, and I think we all can agree that there's a lot of things at play with this. And even as we process some of the recent things that have been happening that have made food access even harder at times, like if we think back to just the not so distant past of November and December, where folks had access to food stamps potentially threatened or suspended for a period of time. What do you guys view as a food bank's role and what we can do in light of we're hearing that a lot of this is emotional and not just logistics? Shereen, do you have thoughts? And we can kind of pass down to whoever.
Yeah, I think Sean's research really highlights how decisions are actually made. So in traditional economics, we think of the human as all knowing, rational, logical. In reality, we're all fallible. We don't know everything, and we're afraid of uncertainty. So I think Sean's research really gets to the heart of the reality of how we make decisions. So what can our role be? Now that we know that, it's really how do we change the narrative? How do we redefine food insecurity in our community? I think that's a very powerful opportunity for us here.
Yeah.
One thing I really like that Sean did is he gave dignity to the people that gave responses. They're people that are struggling. They're not foolish people. They're not lazy people. They're struggling people. And it could represent any of us. And I think, I think Dare to Care has done a great job. I think a lot of the food pantries have tried to, with such an unknown and unsure environment, treat them like intelligent people. Be honest, but don't create fear. But I think that, we show them the respect of, we're going to get through this together and we're going to do everything we can to make sure that you have what you need. So I think a clear message, honesty, but, also not trying to introduce fear into it.
I think it's an opportunity for us to really think about the language that we use and the framing that we use as it relates to food insecurity and the impact on individual lives and the decisions that people are having to make every day. One of the things we often talked about was we want to make sure when our neighbors are coming to our partners that they have a dignified experience. That was one of the reasons why we started driving an effort for client choice where individuals can go to a food pantry and choose the food as opposed to just having it already prepackaged because we wanted to provide that dignified experience. This also helps me to understand how important it is for our communication and our marketing and how we're sharing the information, helping people to understand how people are having to make decisions, but making it easier for folks to be able to feel like, you know what? If I got to make a decision between medicine and food, I have the food pantry right down the street. Let me go and let that be a dignified experience. So we have a responsibility, I think, as a food bank to help our city and to help our partners to really redefine in terms of what hungry even looks like.
Yeah, that's really great. And I think what's so interesting and unique about this phase of the research is we've been so used to talking about neighbors who we actually serve. And this is kind of going a little further upstream to start to think about, well, who are we missing? Who could really use these services and access the pantries and they're not coming, which is kind of a hard thing to wrap your mind around when you sit in seats like I sit in as a food banker and we're like, oh, we're serving the people, to start to think, well, who's missing? Who are we not getting to? One of the really interesting things that Sean has talked about as we've gone over the data, and of course, there's not time to just dig into everything, but one of the things that Sean has educated me on is there's this beautiful resilience among the neighbors who do visit pantries. And so when he's done the research in the focus groups, the people who are coming are getting in text groups and they're sharing resources and they're sharing, did you know about this? Did you know where you could go and get this service or this resource? But it's really interesting because it sounds like that same kind of community exists with the folks and that thought of, we want to think about someone else before ourselves. So there really is this beautiful kind of altruism. And Shane, this is for you mostly. Can you talk more about what you see and the sense of community that exists among the folks that actually come into the pantry? Because it sounds like we're also seeing that there is still community, even for the folks we're trying to get to come in.
There absolutely is. We have a lot of people that come to our pantry for the drive-through portion of it that they carpool. They will look for neighbors that live in their community, whether it's on their street or in their neighborhood, and they'll try to make sure that they have a ride. Especially if it's somebody that's elderly or without transportation, then they'll try to carpool. So that's a huge thing that we see, which is amazing. We also have people that'll come and it'll be their first time and they'll say, hey, I was referred by so and so who comes and visits you all often. We also do deliveries. So we get a lot of referrals there. We'll have people say, hey, I notice I have an elderly neighbor. I don't see him getting out a lot. I feel like they could use some help. Is there any way that you all could reach out to them? So I do see a lot of the community responding and trying to take care of each other. So it's a pretty beautiful thing to see.
Yeah. And Vincent mentioned, thinking about what we can do and how we can take this research and actually apply it. And I heard you mention communication and thinking of ways that we can actually start to figure out how can we reach the folks. And it seems like one of those ways could be through these networks that already exist among the folks. So Shireen, this is a little bit for you. Could you talk to us a little bit about what you know about what it takes to kind of get people to think about changing their behavior, and what are some tools that are available to help folks with messaging and things that we could possibly do?
Yeah, so it's not really about the loss of food. It's about the loss of self-identity. We heard deference, shame. We live in a society where you work hard and you do well, and if you're in trouble, well, it's your fault. You're a failure. So that creates the concept of moral loss. I feel like a failure. There are other people who deserve it more. I don't deserve it, which leads to self exclusion. So how do we change that narrative and normalize pantry use? And going back to food and shelter, I mean, there are always trade-offs. How do we get to that point where food is seen as being as important as your utilities?
Mhm. Thank you. When you think about what we do here at Dare to Care, what are some things that you think we could actually do to build on the message and to help partners support getting this message out that pantry use should be normalized?
Right. I think that is a key point in terms of being able to normalize pantry use and then how it's actually used. Because a lot of times, as people, when they actually discover when they come to the pantry and they realize that the quality of food, the service, the smiles that they receive, the welcoming that they receive, that it's like, wow, this experience is not anything like I imagined. I was really ashamed to come here, or I really didn't want to because of my condition and I felt like a failure. But you all have helped me to feel better in my situation that I was already experiencing a lot of trauma to begin with. So I think it's also important for us to be able to think about helping our partners to understand trauma informed care. What is really happening when people show up to your space, and how do you respond to them? How do you help them to feel good about their experience, and how they feel better about leaving? They feel better when they leave than when they came in. And it's much like what I believe an opportunity for us, again, is really helping to share with folks really the power that we had in helping them to be able to move from a very difficult situation to being able to feel better about and hopeful about the future. Yes, my situation feels dire now, but after this experience, I feel hopeful. And that's what we really want to provide, because once you lose hope, you lose everything. And so many people, when they come to our pantries, they feel hopeless and helpless. But if we can begin to restore that hope and restore the helpfulness that people have in the community coming together, it gives them a whole new sense of purpose that, hey, I can help. I can use this to body me over. And then I can use the other resources to be able to help me come out of this situation.
Yeah, thank you.
I know for us, we have been really grateful. A lot of the people that serve at our pantry are people that were receiving food boxes or do receive food boxes. And so they, they treat the guests that come in like, hey, I'm in the same shoes as you. I'm in the same boat. We're all struggling together. And I think that experience when they come does make a big difference in how they feel. And it is difficult when you hear people say someone has it worse. Our organization, we deal with it even with the unhoused population. I mean, this week in the cold, we try to hand people warming supplies. Well, hey, I can stay a little bit warmer than the next person. Why don't you take it to them? And so it is a difficult barrier to try to get past. But I think messaging and letting them know it's okay. This is a safe place. This does not demoralize you. So I think destroying some of those things is important.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. So it sounds like there's lots of opportunity for taking the research that we're hearing today and figuring out how can we also not just help ourselves as Dare to Care, but also our pantries to figure out what we can do to tweak some of our messaging to make that normalization of service utilization a little bit easier. And I was reflecting last night as I was thinking about this, even at Dare to Care, we're always, working and trying to figure out what's the next thing. So even before we had this research, I can remember some teammates sitting around a table, and you all may or may not know, but we have some food boxes that we give out at our Fern Valley location. Not because it was designed to be a pantry, but because when people come to a food bank, they just know we have food and they believe they can get something, and we don't want folks to walk out empty handed. So we give out boxes, and we have just for years just always called them emergency food boxes, right? It's just been the informal way that we've talked about them, because for us, it's an emergency to do them because it's not part of moving 27 million pounds of food. It's a one box. But hearing Sean's opening that people are talking about this feeling of just trying to survive is every day. This our emergency food box isn't necessarily an emergency for the folks coming to receive that. And we had a teammate offer up to us that maybe we should stop calling it an emergency food box because it's our emergency. We're not equipped to give them out. But for the neighbor who's coming to receive them, this is their everyday life. And that really was a powerful shift for us inside. And so it just had me thinking about what could this look like for us, and particularly Vincent, for you with us as a food bank, and Shane, for you to think about this as pantries in general. But what would a world look like if we were going to start shifting some of our language from come get your emergency box to something that said, hey, come when you need it, or dare I even say, come often to keep from needing it? What would that look like for us when it comes to things like funding? Shane, what would your thoughts be of, do you feel like more people would come, and just talk a little bit about what that could look like?
I do. And I think that changing the language on, this is what you do when you have no other options. I think by the time that a person gets to that point, it's too late. Because how many days have they went without food? For people that we have call in sometimes that I've been adding water to a can of vegetable soup for 3 days now, trying to make it last as long as I can, and then they call. So I think messaging is important, and definitely getting the food to the individual before it's a last resort. So I think that is very important.
I think we have an opportunity to really live out in terms of what our mission in terms of working together to provide pathways to end hunger. And when we think about that from Dare to Care's perspective, it really gives us an opportunity to really think about our neighbors in the sense of as partners working together to create these pathways to end hunger, but also being able to help and understand the power that exists in community, and that it is a community, that we are a loving community. I think one of the things that we understand and we talk about how helpful we are, how people stand up, and when the crisis arises, the community stands up. And Louisville is a very special place. And we talk about those things, but how do we live those things out in everyday life that people really feel that? And those who are marginalized, those who are could consider they're struggling, what we've identified, there's probably a better term, but we call the working poor, people who work every day, but yet they don't know how they're going to make ends meet. And ends never meet because they was never designed to meet. And so we have to help people to really understand coming together in a sense of community, that this is just a part of community. I remember there was a time, and you probably will look at me and say, you don't remember that, but I actually do, when you could go to your neighbor and ask for different items of food. You could get a cup of sugar, you could get some flour. I remember my neighbor coming over and getting things, and then I'm going over my neighbor's house and getting things. When did that stop? And I think it stopped when we stopped knowing who our neighbors are. I lived in a community, I lived in several different communities, and literally 2 doors down took me 3 years to learn, I'm ashamed to say this, of who my neighbor actually is. I knew their name, but I didn't know anything about them. And I think that that's something that we can do in our community, is really become that beloved community where we really are concerned. And the way you build concern and understand and trust is that you get to know people, and you get to know what their neighbors or know their family, know the traditions, and then helping people to make that transition.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I know a lot of people ask, well, who is the face of food insecurity? What are we talking about? And when we started, we had the 1 in 7 folks stand up, and that truly is the face. Every one of those faces truly is the face of those who are food insecure among us. So I love your vision and idea of how do we get to be the community where we see everyone as our neighbor. Can we talk a little bit more about that, Shane and Vincent, even for you, as we think back to the story of Bobby Ellis? And what does it mean to actually check on your neighbor? I know, Shane, you've been out just, today's your day of rest, but you've been out. So, what does that mean from a pantry perspective or a partner perspective to check on your neighbor and get to know them? And then, Vincent, if you could talk about that as it relates to our origin story and what could have helped prevent the tragic death of Bobby Ellis.
So, as a partner, it's important to be a safe place for your community. We cannot view people as just another person in line, another number, another car waiting for a food box, right? Everybody's got a story. I loved what you said about trauma-informed care, knowing your neighbors individually. What has this person experienced? Why are they acting this way? Are they being rude today because they're hungry? They have not eaten for a week. So I think going beyond just knowing what they want in their box to what's going on in their life is extremely important. So I think as a partner, we have a role to play in that for sure. And the atmosphere that we create, does it feel inviting? Does it feel cold like a distribution line? Does it feel like this is an event because we love you and we're glad you're here and we're doing this to support you? And I think we all have a part to play in it. I definitely think it goes back some on the community. Do you know your neighbor that's 2 houses down? Do you know their struggles and their needs? And are you willing to call on a partner? If you know that your neighbor has a need and maybe they're not willing to overcome the barrier of admitting that there's something wrong, are you willing to call on their behalf? And what does that look like? And so I think we have a long way to go, but I think there's a lot of great opportunities with the information provided.
I think when it comes to the origin of Dare to Care and how Dare to Care started as a tragic, uh, event with Bobby Ellis and the family, I remember that the first event when I came to Dare to Care 4 years ago was the Bobby Ellis prayer vigil. And when I came to that vigil, I wanted to learn more about the whole story, what was taking place. And the family and what happened to the family. And so I reached out to Bobby's sister, and her name is Nick. We call her Nikki, and Nikki Ellis. And I reached out to her and I said, "Hey, I'm the new CEO of Dare to Care, and I understand in terms of from the origin of Dare to Care that it was the impact of your family. Really, your family was the family that started this because the community said, as a result of the death of your brother, that we will not tolerate this." Well, when I called her, she could not, she just went over and over, just say, "Thanking you, thank you for just reaching out to me. You know, if someone would have reached out to us and my family when my brother died, maybe he would still be living today." And that hit me at the core of really what power we have in just checking on our neighbors. It was actually a faith group that actually went to the house and discovered the family, and found out that had children in the house that was literally dying of malnutrition because they didn't have food. But think about, this was a JCPS student. This was a family that had neighbors on each side. How did it get that far? And I think that continuing to share that message, and that's one of the things that I've been doing since I heard that from Nikki, is check on your neighbor. Check on all of your neighbor. Who is my neighbor? My neighbor is the person who's next to me. My neighbor is the person who's down the street. My neighbor is somebody that lives 20 miles from me, but they live in my community. We all are neighbors. So how do we support and work and really get that human factor out about just being neighborly?
Yeah, and that sounds really important as we start to think about neighbors who are not coming to the pantry, right? So, very much like the story of the Ellis family who had need, wasn't able for whatever reason, or didn't seek a pantry service or something like that. Were you going to add something, Shane?
Well, just, I mean, even this week, we talk about this event that happened a while back ago. We have done our best as an organization and many organizations in the city during this cold spell of trying to find people on the street and bring them in. If you see somebody that looks unhoused, that looks cold, call, right? If they don't have access to a phone, call. And so, a gentleman lost his life this week, not that far from here, sitting outside of a business with no shoes on, and passed away. So it's still going on. We still have to be proactive. That people matter. They may not look like me. They may not dress like me. They may not have the same background as me, but we are neighbors. And I need to do my best to try to look out for them.
So, in addition to all the work that we can all do as viewing people as our neighbors and checking on them, but can you talk to us a little bit about some of those categories of ways that we can actually start to think about our messaging? Because right after this, we're going to get into a little bit of an activity, and I'm going to ask you guys to take out your phones if you have them. And if you don't, share with a neighbor. But can you talk to us a little bit about some of those techniques and just the ideas behind that there are ways to encourage people to adopt a behavior? In this case, it's to use a pantry.
Yes, and I have many thoughts and many notes on this. So I am going to refer to my notes. You think about deference and shame and how much better it is to go to a food pantry. So, how do we make that first step emotionally safe? That's a big question. And that's really kind of the crux of the matter. How do we get there sooner? Um, One of the things that is a barrier is just that othering. I don't need it, others need it more. That concept really can be flipped by just giving facts. It's working families that use the pantry. It's just a temporary thing to use the pantry. It is not moral loss to use the pantry. Some tangible things that we can do are partnering with other partners, and having that entry point be at similar assistance places. So I'm getting housing assistance. Here is food pantry information. I'm getting medical care. Here is food pantry information. How do we normalize that, where using a food pantry is just a toolkit or a thing in the toolkit, just like a job search is?
That's great. And you mentioned a couple of things, and I want to highlight that of trying to figure out how do you have food or access to food, or at the minimum, the information about how to access food in places where people are already going to help reduce that barrier of having to go to another place. So, Vincent, I'll throw that to you just to talk about some things that we've got, because Shereen, you made a great point where we're already trying to make sure that food is at places that are convenient for folks.
I think one of the opportunities is at a hospital. We have a food pantry at a hospital literally down the street. It made national news, and that pantry at Norton West Louisville Hospital provides access to food. But not only does it provide access, it provides the dignity that we want to provide for our neighbors, but also they make it real easy. You go see a doctor now, recognizing, asking two questions. Hey, we have a pantry that you can go to. Before you leave, why don't you go upstairs to the pantry? And just making it so seamless that when you go to the doctor, you can also get access to food. When you're at school, we have school pantries. While you're at school, not making it a sense that, oh, your family needs the pantry. And kids can be very cruel. So how do we even help kids to feel normalized in the sense that this is a tool for my family to help where they come away feeling good as opposed to feeling bad? And so I think we have an opportunity really to change the narrative as it relates to how people even look at food pantries, how they see that access to food, and we can help people to make it better for them.
What else can we be doing to make sure that food and access to food becomes more normalized so that the folks who may never think to cross the threshold to a pantry can start to see that this is something that's okay and it's available to them? We are always, as Dare to Care, putting out messages either to neighbors or partners or thanking donors or thanking volunteers. But today we want to try to figure out if we can take the research that we've learned from Sean about some of these emotional barriers that are existing and keeping people from accessing pantries to begin to think about how can we tweak some of that messaging with some of Shireen's points that she mentioned to maybe see. So we're going to do what we call a little bit of A/B testing. And if you guys are willing, we'd love for you all to take out your phones. There's a QR code on the screen. All right, so it looks like some of us are getting it. If anyone needs help, please just raise your hand and we'll make sure you're not left out. The first question is which one of these messages do you all, as the audience, because we need your opinion, do you believe normalizes pantry use for neighbors? So we've got three test messages here, an A, a B, and a C. So, what you will see is message A, which says food is available for those in need. B, many working families use pantries to stretch their budgets and remain stable. And then C, did you know many working families use pantries when things are tight? So, three kind of test messages that we'd like to get your thoughts on. And so far, it looks like message B is the one where the folks in our audience feel like that resonates the most. And I will tell you here, there's no right or wrong answer here. So I don't want you all to think we're going to say, and this is the right one. But we did want to invite our panelists, particularly Shireen, if you don't mind, and Shane as well, because you have a pantry and you know the kind of messaging that you guys are needing to put out too. How do you guys react to seeing that B is the one that seems to be resonating the most? And frankly, talking about the ones that you see the most and from Dare to Care, like the message we might use versus the one that seems to be getting the most traction here.
Yeah, this is, if you look at that sentence, it's giving you facts. It's working families. It's families like us. It's families like me who are using the pantries. Why are they doing it? They're doing it to remain stable. It's not about being in poverty. It's not about, just being in crisis. It's just simply a tide over to become stable. So I think that is resonating because we're giving them facts. And that's what I would say. Shane, I'm better.
Yeah. For years, I would see all these infomercials with these sad songs, and you see these almost shock factor, right? Like kids wearing tattered clothing and these houses that are half boarded up. And I think people did that to get an emotional response, but at the same time, what does that do to the people that need the help? Like, they're picturing that in their head. I don't look like that person, so I don't need it. But when you say working family, you think, you know what? I am working, I am trying, and this is going to make me more stable. So I think that that message goes a long way, in my opinion, to making people feel more normal about having to use a pantry.
Yeah. And I will say, just full transparency, I know we've moved the slide, but message A, which was the one that said food is available for those in need, that is our more typical messaging, right? And so, again, we're all learning together. Even as Dare to Care, we've been doing this for a long time, but even we are realizing that there are ways that we phrase things forever that it might be time to freshen up on some of the language. And I think it looks like the audience also agrees, in light of this research, that there's some other ways that we can kind of tweak the messages that exist, keep the intent, but maybe also make sure that we're inviting in people who have excluded themselves. So if we could go to the next one, and for those of you who participated, it should just switch right over for you. You shouldn't have to take the picture again. But if you have problems, let us know. We're happy to help. All right, so this one is about which message we believe would motivate a neighbor to use a pantry sooner than later. Message A, visiting a pantry early can prevent harder choices later, like skipping meals or medication, which we heard about. B, if you're experiencing food insecurity, visit a pantry. And C, if you're experiencing food insecurity, visit a food pantry now. So Shireen, I'll throw that to you. It looks like the audience has spoken, and the top one is A.
I mean, that sentence is doing so many things. It's talking about the future, future oriented. It's bringing it to the present, skipping meals, or skipping medications, those trade offs. It's making that very clear. I also want to comment on message B and C, where we're using the word food insecurity. That's a very far away, removed conceptual word. Is hunger a better word? I don't really think so myself, but that's just distancing you so far from the actual reality.
I love that we're hearing from you guys too, that there's a way that we can kind of tighten up on the language to get people in sooner to a pantry rather than getting to that place where they're making the tough trade-offs. Okay, so if you had a friend who is food insecure, we talked a lot today about being the neighbor and meeting your neighbor. If you went to check on a neighbor and you knew that they could use a pantry, which one of these messages would be the one that you'd be more likely to use to try to compel them to visit a pantry? Folks are still kind of going in, but message C looks like it's bringing it home.
Yeah, I think that makes so much sense, because it goes back to deference and shame. It's really that shame piece that we're catching here. Um, if you are a neighbor, what you're speaking to your neighbor, you're speaking like a normal person. Telling me that volunteers are at pantries to help seems so far removed. It's not the most human way to speak to somebody you care about. But saying, pantry, the experience is respectful, it's private, it's judgment free. Those are also making a real human connection. It's that understanding that, you know, I feel shame and there is no shame in it. And explaining that a little more directly, I think, is why this option won out here.
Yeah. We're going to transition out of this and get to the part that I think people are really excited about. We have some time for Q&A.
I just wanted to bring up the messaging that you all have been talking about, and it's mostly been in the perspective of the clients, the people in need. And I wanted to see what your thoughts were about shifting the mindset and reducing or eliminating judgment and prejudice from people who are not in need. Because a part of that messaging and a part of getting people to be encouraged to use food pantries is from that perception that they're getting from people outside their situation.
I think it could be one and the same. So I think getting that image out that it's also working families. If you start seeing images of people that are working and trying and supporting families, then all of a sudden they can identify like this could be me. So I think it could actually be both ways.
I definitely would agree with that. I think again, you have an opportunity to help people to make that transition in their thinking and their behavior when you recognize identifiable factors, families, working families, and also helping people to understand that many people are literally just one paycheck away from having to experience this. One, loss of a job, simply your whole life changes. So I think in terms of really helping people to understand that this is a tool and resource for all life disruptions, whatever they may be. You may not need us today, but maybe tomorrow. And so we want to make sure too that we're in a position to be able to help in the future, not only in the present.
I heard Shane mention earlier that a lot of the volunteers at his pantry who are actually helping in the food distribution are actually people who at some point have used the pantry or they currently utilize the pantry. That is one of the most generous offers that I think can be made to neighbors because neighbors who receive food also want to be able to do something to give back and participate in that. And I think that is one of those things. And I appreciated you saying that earlier. I wanted to highlight that. I think that's a model that people do to help make sure that when they're coming in, there's a face that's not of judgment. It's of someone who's walked the same path as you. So thank you for that question.
I have two questions related to the ID question earlier. One of them is, do you feel that that hinders people coming to the food pantry? And then the second would be, if I have a neighbor who's unable to come, can I pick up for that person with my ID, I guess?
We have to think about where we are today. And the reality is, in terms when you talk about IDs, that's very touchy because we understand what's happening with immigrants. We understand what's happening with all the challenges around that. When you think about food banking, remember I said we started 50 years ago. Many food bank models are still designed 50 years ago. And so that's something that we constantly have to think about. Where are we today, and how do we need to respond to our neighbors today? Not what we did 50 years ago, but what are we doing today? And so, what does that mean? And so that also may mean advocacy towards with the government saying we need to change that model, change those things. And so, I think it's a collective work of community working together to improve the quality of life so that every human being can reach their full potential. That's what we define as compassion. That's the greatest compassion that you can display, is understanding my situation and condition and being willing to change to be able to meet that need.
And then the answer to your other question, yes, folks are allowed to pick up food for other people.
Can you partner with school systems that during their registration process, you're providing information on what you offer so that every person knows you're not singling out just those that are in need? Just a thought.
Yes, we could do that. Absolutely. And so we have a great partnership currently with JCPS, where they have identified some of their schools that have the highest need of a pantry. And then they work with their Friskies to set up and operate the pantries. But absolutely, that does not preclude that we could figure out how to get in front of the systems and have them share our information out. Absolutely.
Right, because you're getting to those who know are in need, but this
Absolutely.
gets to everybody that you don't
Absolutely.
know.
Yes. So we're recording ideas. So yes, absolutely.
I do want to say that the information and data you shared today is getting to government. I'm from the Department for Community-Based Services right on 9th and Broadway. So thank you for inviting us. And we'll share that with our staff kind of as we do our work. We also are a part of the neighborhood place that do the back to school resource fairs every year, and Dare to Care is a large part of that. So thank you. My question is, as we have this conversation about food scarcity, so how do we move along the continuum of advocacy to activism? And you all talked a little bit about that, but what does it take to get the boots on the ground to end hunger in our community?
Great question. And let me share also say just yesterday we were in Frankfurt with all the legislators and talking about the work of Dare to Care and the importance of why we exist. I think one of the things that happened during the government shutdown that the country came to understand how important food banks are in our community and what the work and how efficient we are. The governor, during the government shutdown, provided $5 million for the 7 food banks across Kentucky. The key thing is for me is that the recognition of how important food banks are and government is getting this messaging. I'm sharing with everyone that I know, every politician that I know, in terms of really the language around what we're doing and why we're doing it. And we're going to be communicating at a much broader scale. So I think in terms of advocacy, we have an opportunity to be able to really drive a lot of points home for folks to really help educate. So I think in terms of advocacy, we have an opportunity to be able to really drive a lot of points home for folks to really help educate around the idea of that people are in the greatest country in the world, the most wealthiest country in the world. No one should ever be without food. One of the things I often said when I arrived here is that I want to work myself out of a job. And so I went to work in trying to figure that out. I don't want to be here 50 years talking about the same thing that I'm talking about today. And the way that that happens is not only through the individual, but it also goes out to the policies that are being created that are creating conditions for people to experience food insecurity to begin with. So how do we work collectively with our government officials, with our neighbors, with our community to really begin to build an infrastructure in a pathway? And that's why I love our mission, a pathway to end hunger. We're doing that. And this is one of the opportunities in terms of what we're doing now and in creating that pathway to end hunger.
So, some things that we have percolating but have not fully ramped up yet is trying to develop a neighbor advisory board or group. So, that is where we will have the voice of the neighbor around the table. So, we don't have to always wait for a 3-year research study to hear what's going on and to get feedback and to do these kinds of things to test messages. And I think what you'll notice is you'll see Dare to Care out and more engaged in the community more than ever. And that is part of trying to get that advocacy and turning into activism with the people who can do that with us. So I appreciate that question too.
My question has to do with the barriers to utilizing the resources. And I'm wondering whether you've ever considered various experimental strategies, trying different things to bring people in.
You will see Dare to Care as the food bank out in the community more where people are already gathering, which is something new that we're doing. So, for instance, if there are, and again, we're a lean organization, so we've got 80 folks. So it depends on people resources, but you will see us out at things where we've got folks gathering. So when Norton West Louisville has a big, fair or an annual something or block parties and things like that, Dare to Care, if we have the people resources, we're out there making sure that people know and showing them on tablets how they can navigate finding a pantry. So we are getting out to things that are not just food related. And then on the other hand, we're also trying to pair some of those things in with things that we already do. So, for instance, we always every year celebrate the Bobby Ellis Memorial, and now we're turning that into a mobile food pantry. And so, for the last few years, not only have we had the memorial to recognize and honor that young man's life, we're also turning it into an event where folks can come get food. We actually have engaged in a pilot to try to get some of our senior commodity boxes delivered. And that was a very successful project that we were able to do. It was a try, it was grant funded. And so the other point that I want to drive home is also these innovations and the things that we'd like to try and do. And I use this word a little dramatically, but I'm very serious. It would require a revolution. So if Dare to Care were to do that, and we understand the need of transportation, and actually on our last panel, we had the director of TARC here to talk about that. But getting food delivered to neighbors would require a revolution for Dare to Care. Now, I'm not saying it's not one we don't want to go on, but that requires a lot of things. That requires appetite for funders to say, hey, we see the value in completely changing that. It is wildly expensive. And that's why that pilot that we tried, we also didn't continue. We tried it because it was grant funded. When it came time to say, is this something that we could budget in and afford? We couldn't. It's really expensive to do. And I think for partners like Shane, we do have a small handful of partners who are able to do delivery. But for our partner agencies, that requires an army of volunteers, unpaid goodwill volunteers who are out doing this work. So I love that question. And I just want to share out the other side of that is the reality is it's hard. Pantry partners need solid volunteers who can come, who they can count on to build out delivery programs. And for Dare to Care to do that, because again, we're handling pounds by the millions. That would be a revolution for us to do that. Right now, we're trying to figure out how can we help our partners get food delivered. But again, that means they need capacity, bandwidth, funds, volunteers, and all that kind of stuff.
We have mobile pantries that actually go into areas that we don't have partners. And the mobile pantries are designed and set up so that we can go to an area, not only if they don't have a partner, but we can respond to emergencies like floods, tornadoes, whatever the case, light out, power outages, that we can respond to communities very quickly and very efficiently, and that it provides an opportunity for our neighbors to have access to that food.
This is a question to Shane. You said something about if you see a unhoused homeless person out on the street, we feed them. Okay, they still out there. What number do you call?
If you call 311, you can report that there's somebody on the street. And out of the Office of OSS, you've got the Office of Homelessness, which has the HEART team. And I know they've really ramped up their efforts.
One of the most innovative responses to hunger that I've learned of Dare to Care is medically prepared meals. And it seems to me that that was a response. Can you talk just a little bit about whether or not that program can be proactive in providing medically appropriate food at the pantries?
Thank you. That's a great question. So, just background for folks who haven't heard of that. So, Dare to Care, in addition to the food that you think of that comes out of our warehouse, produce, fresh produce, frozen food, and pantry stable food, we also have hot meals from the kitchen that you'll see later. And we also prepare frozen meals that go to a lot of our senior high rises. And then we also have medically tailored meals, which are meals that get prepared for folks who meet a certain diagnosis. So the ones that we've done so far have been folks who have who need the DASH diet, which is like a low sodium heart healthy diet, as well as we've prepared diets for folks who've had gestational diabetes as well as diabetes. And so we have run small pilots. My friend used the word experiments, but we have done that. Those have been grant funded to date, and they are wildly successful. So the research shows that it is much less expensive. And if you'll allow me to be casual, it is cheaper to feed people than to have them in the hospital. Flat out. And so we could feed someone a medically appropriate meal that meets all of their guidelines 3 times a day, get it delivered to their home for less than it would cost a night in the hospital. All of the research shows that. It's not new, it's out there. We can point you to the website. So we underwent a year-long study with an agency called Food as Medicine Coalition, and we became one of their agencies where they taught us how to do this. So our talented kitchen folks have been hard at work trying to figure out how to do this and make the meals good too, which is the other thing. And what's interesting is we're not the only ones who know that this works. The research is out there. It goes back to the question from our friend here who talked about how do you take good ideas into advocacy, into activism. And that's one place I will say that some other states have us beat in the sense of they've got some legislative priorities that have allowed for insurance companies to pay for those meals. And so there are places like New York and North Carolina and a few others that have the legislative will to together decide that using the Medicaid system, we can save money by providing people the food that's tailored to their medical needs rather than hospitalizing them. So, politics aside, Kentucky's not there yet. We are working with all of the folks from universities to government officials to other folks who are in the food insecurity and hunger battle to build coalition around trying to get that passed here. So the long answer to your question is yes, we believe that is something that will interrupt so many cycles from health to poverty and everything. And it's going to take a lot of work. And until such time that our legislative, priorities catch up with the research, we're going to be relying on grant funds and funders and potentially maybe insurers who want to go on that journey with us as a proof of concept until the state legislature kind of catches up with the research that shows that this is a good way to take care of people's nutrition needs and their health needs. So thank you. That is a great point that we didn't have a chance to highlight, that we do believe that food is health here and food is medicine. So I appreciate that question. I think that was our last question. We want to just pause, and I want to thank our panelists here today. If you'll give them a round of applause. Thank you. And to Sean as well for that wonderful presentation. It's just great. I want to thank you guys really for showing up. Again, how I started is, it's a cold, snowy Saturday, and you guys could have been anywhere. But the fact that you guys chose to spend this morning with us, it really moves me. It shows that hope is still here and that people still choose to rally around things that are important. One last thanks to Humana Foundation, who made all of this research possible. Thank you guys so much.